research conversation of Michaelmas term of this academic year. This conversation is, of course, a little bit unusual because it is a conversation online by Teams, but we are here, we are together, and welcome to everyone. I would like, because Eugene probably is trying to join us, we are going to switch the order of the presentation. And we are going to have two very exciting presentations today. So Eugene Rogan in conversation with Christian Zanner and Alison Salvesen in conversation with Robert Simpson. And since Eugene is not yet here, so we would like to begin by the conversation of Alison Salvesen with Robert Simpson. And I hand over to Robert to introduce Alison and the topic. And we have, and we have to switch off our cameras when we are not talking. Please.
I didn't realize I had to do the introduction too. This is a very impressive work that Alison is going to be talking about today. I understand it developed out of a year-long symposium, which sounds very interesting in itself. I'm not quite sure how you have one that lasts for a year, but anyway. And it's a huge book of 700 pages with 25 weighty articles in it, not like the sort of 10 pages that we're usually told not to exceed when we contribute articles to collections of essays. As an Egyptologist, I am both sort of connected with this and not, because obviously it deals with Egypt, but not with the sort of things that, for the most part, not with the sort of things I'm concerned with academically. So I think I'd better hand over to her now.
Thank you, Robert. Can everybody hear me okay? Now, this project was actually only 6 months, so it wasn't a full year. We ran it from January to June in 2016, and basically the project grew out of an awareness on a number of us within Hebrew and Jewish studies of this apparent contradiction between what the Hebrew Bible in particular says about Egypt, in that it's a very negative, dangerous place to be, but also it's seen as what Diana Lipton has called the seductive other. It's such a total contrast geographically, socially and religiously to the people of Israel in the land of Israel, that it exerted this complete fascination for the biblical writers. But there are very strong warnings within the biblical texts that say, don't go back there. You were rescued by the Lord God from Egypt, so you're not meant to go back. It's a really dangerous and sinful place. Don't go there. You're not allowed. But then, of course, in reality, there were huge Jewish communities in Egypt, so starting quite small with the Arameans in Syene or Elephantine, way down below on the Nile. And also in Lower Egypt, there were communities that the prophet Jeremiah refers to in the book of Jeremiah. And then there was really continuous settlement by Jews in Egypt for many centuries, really actually until about 1948 if you want to take the full span, but we only examined up to the medieval period. So this was an interesting project that we wanted to see, how did Jews reconcile the fact that scripture is so negative about Egypt and says don't go there, with the fact that people settled there in very large numbers. It would be a bit like saying America's a terrible place, you should live in modern day Israel. It's a very simple place to be in America, and yet you've got a very large Jewish population in a number of places in the States, particularly say New York. So it's an interesting balancing act, as it were. And so we put this proposition to the Hebrew Centre through what's called the Advanced Seminars in Jewish Studies, funded by the Polonsky and Dorset Foundations, to whom we're enormously grateful for this support. And we had residential scholars and visiting scholars for a course of 6 months with a conference at the end. And it was a really very exciting time, probably one of the highlights my academic life from that point of view. So here we have what was particularly useful for our purposes. It wasn't just a matter of comparing different literary sources, but Egypt being the way it is, it originally, of course, before the Aswan Dam was built, the sands of Egypt were extremely dry. There's not much rainfall, so a lot of papyri were preserved from the antique period. In Greek and to some extent in Aramaic as well, down from Elephantine. So these, you might know quite a big collection of Oxyrhynchus papyri in the Sackler Library, for instance. So a lot of primary evidence there. And then in this later period, in the medieval period, the Cairo-Geniza texts were discovered at the end of the 19th century, which were a lot of Jewish texts that had been sort of bunged into the storeroom or attic of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, and kind of forgotten about for a very long time. And then I suppose we would now say sort of plundered by Victorian scholars and brought back to Europe and studied there. And so we have two really important caches of primary evidence, the papyri on the one hand, and then the text from the Cairo-Geniza on the other. And they're not the only ones, but they are really substantial bodies of evidence that we can look at. And particularly there are a lot of legal documents in both sides, actually, but particularly on the Cairo-Geniza side. And there are also literary texts, as I mentioned earlier. There's the Hebrew Bible and its many references to Egypt. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was largely carried out in Alexandria and other places in Egypt, as far as we know. And of course, translations often let slip slight biases and changes against the original text. So we looked at that to see whether there was reflected anything about attitudes to Egypt there. Then there's a lot of Hellenistic Jewish literature, works like Three Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, vast numbers of works by Philo of Alexandria, the philosopher and exegete, Letter of Aristeas. For the medieval period, we have the Piyut, the Jewish liturgical poetry, legal halakhic texts, and also sort of secular court texts, as it were. Secular poetry by people like Judah Halevi, who visited Egypt. Maimonides, of course, was based in Egypt, and we have texts written by his own hand from this period as well. So we had quite a range of different scholars who were experts in working on these different texts. So as for findings, if I can sort of briefly summarize, as you say, there's 25 different essays and there's a lot of different findings. But overall, we noted that the Jewish discomfort about being in Egypt forbidden by the Bible depended really on how biblically literate people were. If they didn't know the scripture, that probably didn't bother them that they were in a place that was prohibited by Torah, as it were. The other thing is that when things were going well for them, they often didn't really reflect on where they were and what they were doing. Contemporary circumstances were very pertinent to how they felt. If there were times of oppression or persecution or difficult circumstances, then there was more reflection. Are we supposed to be here? If we're not being blessed, maybe we're in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's also the question, do we have any choice? We may need to be here because perhaps it's not safe to go back to the land of Israel, or it's not possible to economically to make a living there, and so on. Some Jews seem to have reconciled where they were living in Egypt by arguing that their stay was only temporary, or they were there just for trading purposes, which seems to have been allowed by the rabbis. Somebody like Philo spiritualizes the whole thing. He sees that the whole purpose of life is a kind of spiritual migration from the bodily passions into a higher spiritual reality, and therefore Egypt functions as a kind of carnal state that one must be liberated from in order to get to the promised land of a higher spiritual reality. And so he can reconcile actually living in Egypt, in Alexandria, and with really escaping in a spiritual sense, and not being bothered about the fact that he was physically based in Egypt for pretty well the entirety of his life. And another fairly important finding, I think, was the common conception that Jewish life in Egypt came to an end abruptly in about 117 of the Common Era, following a very violent revolt by Jews in North Africa against their Roman rulers, and it was a vicious war on both sides, and Jews seem to have been wiped out in large numbers. And it's always been thought that after that, Jews didn't really come back and settle in Egypt for centuries. In fact, the signs from papyri and mentions in patristic literature show that there was a Jewish presence all that time through, well into the early medieval period, but it was just at a much lower level and kind of passed under the radar to a large extent. But certainly after the 5th century, we do see a kind of resurgence in Jewish fortunes. And into the medieval period under Islam, there was a strong presence in both Alexandria and Cairo of large, prosperous Jewish communities. One of the essays that I particularly have enjoyed is one by Craig Perry about the irony of Jews owning slaves in Egypt. Of course, in the book of Exodus, they're portrayed as being enslaved by the Egyptians here. They own slaves in Egypt. And what this meant on a practical day-to-day basis, and here the text from the Cairo Geniza, the legal text about slave ownership and manumission and things like that, have been particularly important to reveal what daily life was like for both owners and slaves. Also, we can see to some extent from these legal texts how Jews coped with their minority status under Arab Muslim rule, and that is also an interesting perspective for somebody like me who doesn't really work in the medieval period. So I think it was an enormously interesting and valuable text. I think I've rather forgotten that I actually had some slides. So if Emily could possibly show first of all the first one, which has got the book doesn't look very interesting actually on the outside. Sadly, Brill did a wonderful job with the contents, but it's actually not a particularly attractive exterior. And then the second slide, it just shows really what the land of Egypt looked like in the classical period. And you can see many settlements all the way down the Nile. The Nile was particularly fascinating actually for Jews because it was so different from the land of Canaan or Palestine, with its dependence on the autumn and spring rains. The flooding of the Nile was a source of great wonderment to Jews and to many other people, and it was regarded as its fertility was legendary, of course. So very important feature of their sort of mental picture of what Egypt was like and why it was in a way blessed as well as a potentially dangerous place to be. The third map, Emily, if you could bring that up. This is just to show the Jewish communities. You can see that it wasn't just Alexandria that they were based in, but they also had quite a presence in a number of villages. Leontopolis, which is down towards the bottom, famously had a Jewish temple that was built following the Maccabean period. There was a family of priests, the Enaids, who escaped from Palestine, from Judea, and gained Ptolemaic approval and managed to build a kind of Jewish temple of their own down here, which of course is another way that this was going against the strictures of the Bible, that you shouldn't have a temple anywhere but in Jerusalem. And so this was to some extent a rival. We don't quite know what went on here, but it was certainly destroyed by the Romans at a later date because it might have been a focus of Jewish revolt against them. But very important, and Josephus talks a fair amount about it in two of his works. And there were also, I'm trying to see whether I can see it on the map, but certainly there's also one of our essay contributors, Margaret Williams, looked through the archaeological reports for Edfu and found that, in fact, there's a lot of syncretism going on. The original archaeological reports have made out that Jews were living in some kind of ghetto, and described it in those sorts of terms. The archaeology goes back to about the 1930s, I think, but this was really quite untrue. They seem to have been living really quite close to the non-Jewish population of Edfu. They also had in their houses some rather syncretistic looking idols and little souvenirs, as it were, from the local Egyptian temple. So we see on the ground that there were Jewish communities living in a fairly assimilated way, or a semi-assimilated way, and certainly not ghettoized in any sense. And then the final picture was produced for us. This is the final map, number 4. This gives a picture of medieval Egypt and was drawn up for us by a marine geographer from Southampton University, which is very good of him to produce this. But we're just showing the way in which, in fact, the land of Israel wasn't at all far away from Egypt, and you could get a boat between the two quite easily. You didn't have to travel by land. And these were some of the settlements that were mentioned in the book as being relevant to Jewish life in this period. So I think that's all I have to say. That there are so many essays, it just isn't possible to comment on all of them. Or if we had been able to take the project any further, I would like to have done more on the Egyptian side, because often there's a very, particularly for the period of antiquity, which is what I was interested in, there's a very negative attitude towards the local Egyptian population. The Greeks in the Ptolemaic period come off quite well, but the Egyptians are really quite despised, and I would like to see what was happening on the Egyptian side, and whether there were ever any good relations between the two communities. Thank you.
I hope everyone can see me. All I can see is the slide.
I can see you, Robert. So.
Okay, right. Well, there are so many things I could say. It's difficult to know quite where to start. I particularly noticed what you said at first, Alison, about Egypt being regarded both as a dangerous place but also seductive. And as an Egyptologist, I can relate to that quite easily. It's a place where obviously we want to go because we're fascinated by it and want to find out about it. But at the same time, there are all kinds of problems ranging from tummy trouble to being shot by the Muslim Brotherhood or something like that. So. Another thing was the difference between Egypt and the Holy Land. The Egyptians themselves were quite, on their side, were quite impressed by this when they went to the Syria-Palestine area. They expressed surprise that the sun god managed to get water to them by dropping it on them out of the sky, instead of doing it in the normal way by making the Nile flood for them, as he did in Egypt.
Fascinating.
The relationship between the two countries is an odd thing. From the Egyptian side, I've been aware for ages that the area of the Holy Land was the closest literate civilization to Egypt, and so one might hope to get all kinds of useful information from the sources in that area. And yet, of course, the material is almost completely useless from an Egyptological point of view. And indeed, we get embarrassed by the number of requests from biblical scholars, I should say it's primarily Christians rather than Jews, but who want information about the Exodus and what the Egyptian sources are for the Exodus and things like that, to which of course we have to reply, well, there isn't really anything.
Quite.
So it was a great relief in a way to find that this book doesn't actually deal with that aspect of Jewish life in Egypt in the direct sense of having a chapter about the sojourn in Egypt and the Exodus. And yet, as I think it was quite clear from your presentation, the experience recorded within the Jewish scriptures of enslavement in Egypt and rescue from it completely dominates the, well, at least the approach that the scholars working on this project adopted to their material. I'm reminded actually of a story about a similar, well, not entirely dissimilar problem in Islam, where some poor traveller gets stuck in this benighted village in the Atlas Mountains, where the natives try to cheer him up by offering him this hooch that they've produced. And he is slightly perturbed and says, "You do realise that the Prophet told you not to, or told us, I suppose, not to drink alcohol?" To which the reply was, "Well, the Prophet didn't have to live here."
Yeah.
And I suppose I'm finally working up to a sort of question here. Throughout history, there's always been a tension in religions between what people are supposed to do and what they actually do. And the Jewish presence in Egypt is supposed to have started by these people who went there after the destruction of Jerusalem, despite the fact that the prophet Jeremiah told them in uncertain terms not to do it. But not only did they disobey him, but they actually forced him to go to Egypt with them. So there is this tension, I think, right from the start between the ideal of what is supposed to happen and what actually happens, as it were, on the ground. One thing I didn't well, I wasn't very sure about was how far this particular experience of Jews living in Egypt relates to the sort of general problems that happen in religions between what is supposed to happen and what actually happens. And I wondered if you could say anything about that.
Yes, I mean, I think this is very true. I mean, it's interesting that it's Maimonides in particular, who of course is producing his Mishneh Torah and so on, and he is probably one of the ones who shows the greatest alarm about the mismatch of being in Egypt and yet not supposed to being there. But there wasn't really much choice for him in where he had to live at that period. And there's a great deal of unsettled political circumstances across the Mediterranean in that kind of period. And therefore, if you ended up somewhere and it was relatively okay, you're probably likely to stay put and not get too ambitious about making pilgrimages to Jerusalem or settling there and or being buried there. It's probably safer than to live in some ways. So I think this is indeed a tension between the ideal and the necessary or the pragmatic, and it does go back a long way. I suspect that the greater biblical literacy in the later period explains more of the apparent tension in the sources at an earlier stage, particularly in Elephantine. Nobody seems to have been bothered in the least. And then when they write to say that their temple down in Aswan has been destroyed by the locals, and they're writing to Jerusalem for funds to get it rebuilt, they don't quite realise why the temple authorities might not be terribly keen on supporting this venture. So there's quite a range in there, but there's also the feeling that if things are going well, then God must approve of the fact that you're there, even if you shouldn't really be there. But then if things get difficult, then perhaps he's showing his displeasure at your location, and you really should try and get out. But in some cases, the solution is to appeal to God to deliver them where they are, rather than to exit and flee away in another exodus. So anyway, I think we might have used up our time, and Jean is here, so but thank you. And if anybody wanted to ask me any more questions offline, that would be fine.